please welcome to the stage Professor Mike Brewer.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I work now for the Resolution Foundation, which is a London-based think tank devoted to increasing the living standards of low to middle income households. We think about all aspects of economic and social policy, and we like to say that we achieve social change by drawing charts in Excel, so you're going to get quite a few of them tonight, so be warned. I'm going to... This is an outline of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about different things that people might mean when they say the UK has high or rising inequality, because actually the story on income inequality is a bit less interesting than you might think. I'm going to argue that actually maybe rather than income inequality, we should think about wealth inequality. Then I'm going to show you that the key part of the lecture is going to be showing you and arguing that the boom in household wealth in the UK over the last 40 years has had very strong intergenerational impacts. So some generations have benefited much more than others. We're not going to. There is going to be quite a lot of boomer bashing, I'm afraid, and that's what I mean by intergenerational. So comparing people born in different decades, different parts of the 20th century. There's a little bit of hope at the end for the younger members of the audience. The story has changed very slightly in recent years, and then we'll end with a couple of slides on what can we learn from this government's actions, the current UK government's actions, and indeed, perhaps to forestall some of the questions, what might you do or what might you want to agitate and argue for if you are angry or upset at the scale of inequality I'm going to be showing you all. So that's the plan. As Martin said, yes, I wrote a short book at the end of the 2010s on inequality, mostly because during the 2010s it felt to me as an economist that people were talking about inequality far more than at least economists were when I studied economics in the 1990s. So in the 2010s we had organizations like the IMF, the OECD, we had the governor of the Bank of England at the time, we had President Obama, even the Pope, I think, at the point talking about how bad inequality was. And we also had The Economist, famously the free market magazine publishing cartoons about inequality. And here it is, I think, just lampooning one response to inequality. So some very rich people are agitated about the level of inequality, don't like the inequalities in society, but that's okay for them. They can just enrich themselves and distance themselves even further from the poor. So it felt to me that there was this really large increase in people and organizations who were concerned about inequality and talking about inequality. And that was a little bit of a puzzle because the key when people talk about inequality, they tend to talk about income inequality. And on the slide above, you can see the main measure of income inequality that we tend to use. It's called the Gini coefficient. I can't really explain what that is because it doesn't have much intuition behind it, but you'll take my word for it, it is the most commonly used measure of inequality, and it's a fairly boring story, right? So on the left-hand side of the chart, you can see, although the graph doesn't seem to change by very much, on the left-hand side of the chart, that change in the 1980s is very dramatic. So yes, the UK in the 1980s experienced lots of social and economic changes, which really did transform our society. And that's when inequality went up, from about 25% to about 35% on this measure. But since then, so since 1990, the level of income inequality in the UK just hasn't really changed. It's bobbled around a bit, a few rises, a few falls, but not really much going on. So why then, we were wondering, are people talking about income inequality or inequality in general so much more during the 2010s and still in the 2020s? I've got 5 ideas. You may have your own. The first one is, of course, to acknowledge that the UK's inequality might not be changing, but it still has it is still high, okay? And it's high on an international perspective. So you won't be able to read all the labels on this chart, but this chart is showing that same Gini coefficient, but not over time, but compared to all the other countries in the OECD and a few others beside. The UK is marked in green towards the right-hand side of that chart, and the countries that are more unequal than us when it comes to income are the US, Mexico, Turkey, Chile, and Costa Rica. So on this measure, the UK is more unequal than pretty much every other country in Europe and to all the other countries in the G7 other than the US. So we are for sure a high inequality country when it comes to income. And this also tells us that things can be different. So of these countries on the left-hand side with lower inequality than us, many of them are indeed richer than us. It's not like there's a trade-off between being rich and having a low level of inequality. You can both be richer than the UK and have lower inequality than the UK. So this tells us that it doesn't have to be this way, that something can be different. Point number two is to argue that, well, actually, it's not really the change in inequality that matters, it's the level. If you think that inequality is bad for you, and thank you for Martin for reminding me that if you've been to all the other lectures in this series, you will have heard Sir Michael Marmot and you argue why inequality is bad for various social and health outcomes, and you will have heard why inequality can be bad for mental health. But so if inequality is bad for us, then it's the level of inequality that's bad, not the change. And what I've written on this slide is just a couple of references to people who've argued that, yes, indeed, inequality is bad for us, not just for reasons for fairness, but it's actually having negative consequences on our society and our economy. The first of the books I've mentioned is by some IMF economists who I said during the 2010s, a body of research at the IMF was showing that high levels of inequality seem to lead then to lower levels of economic growth. So it's definitely not the case there's a growth inequality trade-off at the level of nations. It's actually, if anything, the causation is going the other way around. High levels of inequality can dampen economic growth, was one of the arguments. And then, like Sir Michael Marmot, I chose to highlight a body of research by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, starting in 2009 with their book The Spirit Level, and then they came back to that at the end of the previous decade. And Richard and Kate, in their book, surveyed a huge quantity of research showing that inequality is bad for health, happiness, trust, social cohesion, and so on and so on. Now, it can be challenging to come up with robust causal estimates in this area. I mean, I'm a social scientist, but you can't run experiments on whole countries, rewinding time and imposing a lower level of inequality to see what happens. But through a whole range of studies, varying in scale from the national level to the local level, Wilkinson and Pickett sort of develop a thesis that inequality is indeed bad for these social outcomes, and I think that's convincing. And then a third reason why you might to be concerned about high levels of inequality is that there seems to be a link between inequality and social mobility. So in social mobility, I'm using that in a fairly precise term in the way that sociologists and economists think about social mobility, and we use that term to mean the links between your own family background and where you end up in life. So it's like generational link. A country with high social mobility is one where your own family background is not limiting where you end up. And a country with low social mobility is one where your parents' backgrounds and circumstances do affect where you end up. And it turns out that although we might think of the US as being the land of opportunity, where anyone can make it with a bit of hard work and graft, that's just not the case, right? If you want the land of opportunity, where family background doesnn't play any role, plays much less role in where you end up, you have to look to the Scandinavian countries. The US is, in fact, one of the countries with the lowest rates of social mobility. Your family background is incredibly important to where you end up in the US, and it's a very high inequality country. So there are three reasons why you might think that inequality is bad for us, and for all of them, the point is it's not whether inequality is rising or falling that matters. It's just the level of inequality. So if you believe those arguments, then you're right to be concerned about the UK because our level of inequality might not be rising, but it is still high. Okay, so reason number three why concern for inequality might be rising is that income growth in the UK for households has been dismal for the last 15 or more years. I've got 3 lines in the chart, which I'm going to talk you through. The graph is showing you the average annual change in income for households at different points in the income distribution. So towards the left, people at the 5th percentile that's the bottom of the income distribution, and on the right, the 95th, 100th is the top of the income distribution. And the graph shows you what's the average change in income, average annual change in income in different periods of time. So we'll start with the blue line. That shows what happened to household incomes during broadly the period of time when Margaret Thatcher was our Prime Minister, during the 1980s, a boom time for Britain, and as I showed you on the first slide, that period of time where inequality really grew quite considerably. So what the blue line shows is that incomes were growing the most in that period for households towards the top of the distribution, and they were growing by the least for households towards the bottom of the distribution. That is just the income distribution stretching out. That's what happens when income inequality goes up. That's fairly standard. The red line is showing the John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown time, more or less. I've stopped the series when the financial crisis happened in 2008. And there you see a much more even line. The line is basically flat. So incomes were growing by broadly the same at most parts of the income distribution. And that means that income inequality wasn't really changing very much. But the crucial point is that income growth at 2% a year on average was pretty impressive, and that's 2% a year of growth having accounted for inflation, so that's a real growth in incomes. If we then look at the most recent period, from 2008 to when this data stops in 2022, the key point I'm making here is that average income growth is just so much lower. So across most parts of a distribution, the average annual change in household incomes was about half, maybe less at the top, a bit higher at the bottom, but still less than 1%. We just haven't had much growth in household income since the financial crisis. And it seems to me that it's that combination of low growth in household income on top of high inequality that makes people notice the income gaps in society and to become more angry about them. And the chart, that pattern I've showed, you could draw a similar chart for the US. You would get broadly the same pattern, at least in terms of how income growth really slowed down after the financial crisis. Okay, so a fourth reason why people might be talking about inequality more is we've just been through two massive economic and social shocks, which I would argue have amplified existing inequalities. So first of all, COVID, and then the cost of living crisis. COVID interacted with inequalities, I guess, in two ways. First of all, you can tell the story about how the health outcomes of COVID, so just morbidity and mortality, had very unequal effects in society in ways that sort of along the traditional, typical fault lines. So there were differences between ethnic minorities, and there were differences between richer and poorer households. But it's also the case that the pandemic was kind of a boom time for better paid households. As long as they kept their jobs or were put on furlough, then they weren't able to spend very much during periods of lockdown. And so household savings soared in the pandemic for those people that had the money to start with. Whereas at the bottom of the distribution, actually, if anything, the cost of living became tougher for some people during the pandemic. So the pandemic basically had exposed, highlighted typical sort of fault lines in society, and then we went straight from that into the cost of living crisis, where obviously the impact of the cost of living crisis is much worse for people who have lower incomes than it is for people of higher incomes. They're less likely to have resources to draw on. They're less able to shift their spending away from those items which are increasing in price the most, and essentially that was energy and food. So it could be that recent shocks have just reminded us of the fault lines in society, of the gaps between the rich and the poor. And of those four items, I'm sure we could have a lecture on each of those. But I guess the one I wanted going to focus on for the rest of the talk is the idea that there's more to inequality than just income, and in particular, it's wealth. So on this screen, I've just grabbed a headline from a recent report on Oxfam. Oxfam, for a number of years, have been tracking wealth inequality at the global level. And they have a fact on global wealth inequality on the left-hand side. They say that the wealthiest 1% have nearly twice as much wealth as gained. Their wealth increased by nearly as much as the rest of the world, put together. And on the right, I have I'm sorry, it should have been a screenshot of actually Piketty in his book, but what changed in a key publication in the 2010s was Thomas Piketty's book about capital in the 21st century, where Piketty was arguing that wealth will grow and that wealth inequality will grow, and if we're not careful, we'll end up back in the sort of early 20th century with a very privileged elite living off their inheritances while the rest of us have much less. But anyway, whether or not Piketty's argument is true, he definitely did a great deal to highlight the importance of wealth and the importance of looking at wealth inequality as well as income inequality, and that's what we're going to do for the rest of today. So we'll start with a couple of facts on wealth inequality in the UK. So wealth is definitely more unequally distributed than is income in the UK. I'm going to switch the statistic I'm using, so we'll abandon the Gini coefficient, and here we'll show instead what are called top wealth shares or top income shares. So we're looking at how much wealth is owned by the wealthiest 10%, that's in red, how much wealth is owned by the wealthiest 1%, that's in blue, and how much wealth is owned by how much income goes to the top 1% of income. So lots of points on this graph, but the point I've just made is that wealth is more unequally distributed than is income. You can see that by comparing the dark blue and the light blue line. The wealthiest 1% have about a fifth of all wealth, which is more than do the people who have the top 1% of income when it comes to income. Their income share is about 10-15%. So wealth is more unequally distributed than income. You can also look at the chart and sort of be amazed at the numbers. So, just me saying it out loud, the wealthiest 1% have 1/5 of all wealth in the UK is probably a fact that may surprise, anger, or whatever some of you. So we should focus on that too. And then we should look at the long-term trend. And actually, if anything, the long-term trend, the very long-term trend, is that there is now less wealth inequality than there used to be. And essentially the period after the Second World War, since the Second World War, wealth inequalities have been falling. If I was to extend the graph back even further, which is one of the things that Piketty did in his work, we could see that the start of the 20th century was incredibly unequal when it comes to wealth, right? With the aristocracy owning basically everything. So in the 20th century, the first 2/3 of the 20th century, we saw some sort of democratization of wealth. So these top wealth shares fell. And then from about 1980 onwards, there's not been much change in wealth inequality. It's kind of bottomed out. And as I was saying with income at the start, the income inequality story looks a bit boring because income inequality hasn't changed since 1990 when measured by the Gini coefficient. Some people also put this graph up and say, well, doesn't this show that wealth inequality also isn't getting any worse? And yes, it's certainly true that these top wealth shares have not changed very much since the 1980s. But differently from income, something else has happened to wealth over the last 40 years. And that is that there's so much more household wealth. Right? So in the last 40 years, the amount of wealth owned by UK households has boomed. So I'm going to measure that on this chart. We're measuring that by looking at the total stock of household wealth, how much stuff do households own, and expressing that as a ratio of national income. And in the 1960s and 70s, that ratio was about 3. Household wealth was about 3 times as high as total national income. It's now, or just before the pandemic, when this data stops, it was about 7. And it is that rise in the amount of wealth in the economy that is behind the social and economic changes I'm going to tell you about. Not that it's become more unequal between rich and poor, but just that there's so much more of it. So just the fact that there is more wealth doesn't show up in the previous slide I showed you, looking at what share is going to the wealthiest. How much wealth is going to the wealthiest 1% or 10% is what we call a relative measure of inequality. If you want to capture the sort of phenomenon I'm showing above, you need to switch to what we might call an absolute measure of wealth gaps. What's the gap in pounds between somebody who's not got much wealth and somebody who's got a lot of wealth? And on the next chart, what we've done is it's a complicated calculation, so I'll try and describe it and then show you it. Is we look at the amount of wealth held by somebody in the middle of the wealth distribution. We look at the amount of wealth held by someone towards the top of the distribution, take that gap and divide it by typical earnings, typical full-time earnings of a worker in the UK. And you get a number out of it. So let's look now at how that ratio has changed. We don't have accurate data on wealth for a long period of time, so quite a few charts I'm going to show from now on are zooming in on the period since 2006. So on the left-hand side of the chart, that series starts at 30. So remember what the calculation is. It's taking the wealth of someone in roughly the middle of the wealth distribution, comparing it to wealth of somebody near the top of the wealth distribution. They're at the 90th centile, if you want the detail, and then dividing that by typical full-time earnings. You get 30. What does that mean? It means that if you were somebody earning typical full-time earnings in the UK, and you worked for 30 years, and you saved all of that, and you didn't pay any tax, but you didn't pay any tax and you saved all of that, then yes, you could move up the distribution from the middle towards the top. And I think this was a measure that popularized by the late Professor Sir John Hills as a way of just another way of trying to get at what are the scale, the magnitude of the gaps between different parts of the wealth distribution. But anyway, so that number, which is obviously that's ridiculous. No one is ever actually going to work for 30 years, not pay any tax, and save all their money. But that number is now 45. And why has that grown? Well, as I showed you, it's not grown because the wealth distribution has become more unequal, right? Top wealth shares haven't changed. That number's grown just because there is much more wealth in the UK owned by households compared to measures like national income, or compared in this case to measures of what people can earn. So this is the key chart to think about. If you're thinking in your head, no, we definitely are more unequal when it comes to wealth, it's probably that you've got something like this in your mind. This is the absolute gaps in pounds between those who have and those who have not have been growing so much. Okay, so that's the sort of, I think, a key exhibit on the growing wealth inequality. So what impact? Yeah. Now we can look at some of the impacts that has by age. I'm going to show you some slides some charts where we're looking at people of different ages, and some slides where we look at people of different generations. So you have to keep up with me. This first one's going to start by looking at differences between people of different ages. Okay, so again, the focus is on the relatively short period of time from 2006 onwards. The amount of wealth in the UK definitely went up in that period. This chart just shows what happened to typical wealth owned by people of different ages over that 12-year period. You can see from the left-hand side towards the middle of the chart that pretty much nothing is going on for younger people. Instead, you can see that rise in wealth has been concentrated amongst older people. So we're not tracking particular people. We're comparing, say, 60-year-olds in 2006 with different 60-year-olds 12 years later. But the point is very clear that the increase in wealth during the late 2000s and 2010s was going to older people. Another way of making the same point is to look at total household wealth in the UK and how it's split between people of different ages. So we would make take the same 2 years as before, 2006 and 2018, and do the comparison. You can see, I think, if you just sort of eyeball the chart, don't focus too closely on the figures, you can see that the weight of the chart is going towards the right. The red bars are higher towards the right than the blue bars. That's saying that older people have now own a higher share of wealth than they do in 2006. In fact, it happens that in the red bars, it's people aged 60 and over now own just over half of all UK household wealth. Sorry, I talked quite a bit about total UK household wealth without giving you much feel of what it actually is. Again, this is the same 12-year period. We can break down total household wealth into 4 categories. So at the top, we have physical wealth. That's just the physical stuff that you might have in your home, your car, your furniture, your jewelry, your expensive artworks, and so on and so on. That's stuff that you can buy and sell. Physical wealth. Green is pension wealth. So this might be money that you have saved into your pension, but you haven't yet retired, or this might be the fact that your company is promising to give you a pension when you retire, if you're a civil servant or someone lucky enough to have a defined benefit pension. Or it might be a pension fund that you're drawing down if you are in retirement. Red is other forms of financial wealth, money in the bank, stocks and shares, any other kind of financial instrument. And blue is housing wealth, net property wealth. So the value of your house that you own less any mortgage. Add all that up together and you get just over £18 trillion. That is what UK households own. And you can see that the largest single category does come in pension wealth. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about UK household wealth. And this graph is also the reminder that even in the last 12 years, we've seen an increase there. So before I go on to talk about particularly the intergenerational story, just got a couple more slides, perhaps exploring why different components of wealth have increased over recent decades. First of all, why is there more pension wealth in the UK than there used to be? Well, here some of this is actually due to government reforms and government changes, and in particular, this chart shows. Just focus on the black line. The black line is showing what fraction of workers are contributing to a pension, and for most of the 1990s and 2000s, it was about a half. But then in the early 2010s, the UK government introduced a reform which essentially, which we call it auto-enrolment, but it changed the presumption to one where workers are contributing to a pension, and it required employers to also put some money into their workers' pension, and there was a bit of tax relief too. And that reform, as you can see from how the black line has gone up, really did make a big difference to what fraction of UK workers are now contributing to their own pension. We've gone from about 50% in the early 2010s to nearly 80%. 80% now. So it is indeed the case that quite recently, UK workers have started saving more for their pension. That's not the only explanation. It is also the case that pension wealth has gone up in ways that have benefited those with large pension pots to start with, but there has also been some spreading out of pension wealth across workers. So that's the pension story. But I think much more interesting and much more relevant for this intergenerational story I want to tell in a minute is what's happened to house prices. So the blue line against the left-hand axis is the average house price, but I've adjusted for inflation. So what that means, average house prices now are about £300,000. That's the blue line on the right-hand side. If we and you can see that, but they're much higher than they used to be, even having adjusted for inflation. And in particular, the boom time for house prices in the UK was the late 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. And from sort of trough to peak, 1992 to 2008, you've got a near trebling of house prices in real terms on that blue line, from just over £100,000 to nearly £300,000 just before the financial crisis came along and took a wallop out of house prices. So, I mean, you can tell so many stories or trace so much of the ills in the UK society to that line, I think, to that chart, I think. To make that real, in green, I'm just also showing how many years would it require a typical person to save for a first-time deposit? Because when you're thinking about housing affordability, there's a lot more to it than just how expensive our houses. You do also need to think about interest rates. You've got to think about how much banks are requiring people to put down for a deposit. So the green line on the right-hand axis is an attempt to sort of put that into context. But the story is very similar. So in the early 1990s, it might take a typical first-time buyer 8 years of typical saving to get enough money for a deposit on a house, and now it takes nearly twice that, 16 years or so. So there's no doubt that houses are indeed a lot more expensive than they used to be. And then what I'm now going to show you is what impact that has had. Well, not just the change in house prices, but also the change in other forms of household wealth. What impact they have had on different generations. And I've got several charts trying to show the same phenomenon in different ways, all drawn in different ways. You might find some of them easier to understand than others, or find your own favorite fact. But let's start with housing. So if house prices go up, that's obviously fantastic if you own a house, and much less fantastic if you don't own a house. And that's particularly going to hurt younger people. So the chart shows what fraction of people owned a house in their early 30s. And on the x-axis, it's showing you sort of what year we're measuring this. So in 2021, the right-hand side, if we look at people who were in their early 30s in 2021, about 45% owned a house. But if we go back to 1979 and look at the people who are in their early 30s, then it was nearly 2/3. It was over 60%. Okay, and then just for colour, I've shown you what we typically call people born in these different periods. So we've got the baby boomers on the left-hand side in teal or turquoise. We've got Gen X in yellow. We've got the millennials in purple. So, totally unsurprising. This chart should be totally unsurprising given what I've just showed you about house prices. House prices soared in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, and as a result, particularly during the 2000s, young people are finding it much, much harder to own their own home. So that's exhibit number one, showing you this intergenerational change. Exhibit number two. Here I'm showing you what we call, I suppose they're life cycle profiles in wealth. So on the x-axis is looking at age, measuring age, and then I've shown how typical wealth changes as people age for different generations. So for people organized by their date of birth. So on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see people who were born in the first half of the 20th century. We've got the first cohort showing here is people born in 1936 and 1940. And on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see that all the lines are essentially above each other. And what that's saying is that at a given age, each successive generation had more wealth than the generations preceding them. I'm using generation here to mean 5-year birth cohorts, not literally a generation. So people born in 1946, at the age of in their mid-60s, had more wealth than people born 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier. That's what I mean by generation-on-generation progress in how much wealth people had. So that pattern's very, very clear, I think you'd argue, for the people born in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and maybe the early 1960s. And then it sort of stops. So all the lines for the generations from 1960 coincide with each other. So people are following the same trajectory. Of course, people are still getting wealthier as they get older, but they're not any wealthier than were their predecessors. So what we say is that cohort-on-cohort progress stopped when it came to thinking about wealth, approximately for people born in 1960. This one I think I'll skip. This is probably the most challenging slide to get your head around. It's not labelled too well. So what we did in this slide was look at people's wealth in 2018 for people born in a particular generation, and compared that to people who were born 10 years earlier. So the right-hand side will focus on those people born in 1991, 1995. We measured their wealth in 2018, compare that to people who were born 10 years earlier at the same age, but 10 years earlier. It turns out those people in 1991, born in 1991, 95, at the end of the last decade, had very slightly less wealth than their predecessors born 10 years earlier. So actually, if anything, we've got negative cohort progress in wealth. Right? And it's even worse for those people who were born in the 1980s. Who by the end of the 2010s, people born in the 1980s had considerably less wealth than people, their peers 10 years younger than them. The yellow is the Gen X mixed story here. Where have all, but as I showed you earlier, where have all the increases in wealth been going? They've been going to the older generations. So people born in 1940s and 1950s, if we measure their wealth at the end of the last decade, it's much, much, much higher than people born 10 years earlier than them. So that's my definition of cohort-on-cohort wealth progress, and we definitely have been seeing that for the baby boomers, and we haven't really seen that. We've not seen that at all for Gen X, and we've seen, if any, according to this chart, if anything, negative. So people. Wealth on wealth, cohort on cohort progress in wealth is falling back for millennials, and I think that is a really big wealth inequality story. Maybe not a change in the difference between the wealthiest and the less wealthy, but a change in how the wealth is shared out between people of different generations. And then I think I think what's then important for thinking about the impact on society and the economy is that this change in wealth is happened at the same time as changes in our labour market and our economy, which meant we had quite a similar pattern when we come to thinking about earnings. So I'm going to draw this here. We're going to look at the same kind of chart where we're tracking how things change by age for people in different birth cohorts, but we're showing typical hourly wages on the axis. So again, if you go to the right-hand side of the chart, lots of things going on. One thing going on is that as people get older, they tend to get paid more. That's normal, and that has stayed stable over time. But on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see that for people born in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, when they hit a certain age, say the age of 40, they were earning more than people born before them at the age of 40. So again, we've got cohort-on-cohort progress in hourly pay. And that shouldn't be surprising. I mean, for most of the 20th century, the UK economy was growing, and therefore so were average earnings growing each year. And as a result, you get cohort-on-cohort progress, with each cohort earning more through their life cycle than previous cohorts. But that came to an end as well. And affecting a fairly similar group of generations. And the graph gets harder to read because the lines coincide. But that's the point. The lines are now coinciding towards the end. We're not getting cohort-on-cohort generation. So if you follow through the 1986 cohort and the 1991 cohort, you can see that, well, for the 1991 cohort, I think the line there stops at the age of 30, 31. They're earning less than people born 20 years. People born 20 people who are 20 years older than, so people born 20 years earlier at the same age. We're no longer seeing generational pay progress either. Now, I think the causes are very different, though. So I didn't really say too much about the causes of that explosion in wealth, but one of the most important causes of the recent explosion in wealth has been a collapse in interest rates. Before the financial crisis, interest rates were typically 4 or 5% in the UK, and after the financial crisis, they're about 0.5%. And if you lower interest rates by so much, then you increase asset values. Economists or even people working in finance, there's basically a one-to-one negative relationship between interest rates and the value of an asset. So when interest rates collapsed from 5-ish% to 0.5%, that was fantastic for anyone who owned an asset, whether that be a financial asset or whether that be a physical asset like your house. And that's the explanation, that's the main explanation for that boom in household wealth, right? Particularly since the mid-2000s. But that's not what's going on here. What's going on here, when we're looking at hourly earnings, is that I think for different reasons, but the same period of time, the UK and other economies saw a collapse in labour productivity. So labour productivity, economic growth, just the drivers of prosperity, slowed down dramatically from the mid-2000s onwards. And it wasn't a financial crisis thing, although it was made a bit worse by the financial crisis. And that has been particularly hard for those generations who are at the start of their careers, started their life cycles in the 2000s and the 2010s. So millennials effectively have the double whammy. They've got hammered by interest rates falling, inflating asset prices, and they've been hammered by labour productivity falling, meaning earnings are no longer growing as much as they used to. That's the generational story of inequality. Now, some of you may have noticed that my charts, not all of my charts have gone up to the most recent years, and and that is because, well, it's partly because the data I'm using is very slow to be published. We don't have very good wealth data for the most recent years, but it's also because the most recent years are slightly changing the story. So the story I've told you works perfectly until 2020, but since then there have been a few changes, and maybe a glimmer of hope for those millennials in the audience. Just some evidence of this. So let me show you the familiar kind of chart where we're tracking how things change over time for people born in different generations. But this one's looking at total household income. Again, the lines sort of stack nicely, so you can see the cohort-on-cohort progress, that every cohort has a higher income than cohorts born earlier. And for the most recent cohorts, so look at the 1981, the 1991, that's still the case. So the 1991 cohort, when we measure their incomes about age 25, they do actually have a higher income than cohorts born earlier. And the 1981 cohort, although they had a bit of a tough time in their early 30s, they dipped below the yellow line, they now have a higher income in their late 30s than do their predecessors. Right, and that's what I mean by cohort-on-cohort progress. So it looks like incomes are turning up, a bit better for the most recent generations. And it's also the case that the story on home ownership is just beginning to turn the corner. So this chart shows the fraction of people who own their home by age for those different generations again. Right, and as I showed you earlier, home ownership rates have definitely fallen. Right, I showed you earlier that millennials age 30 were much less likely to own their own home than previous generations in their early 30s, and that's definitely the case. This graph also shows that a really big gap between the two reddish brownish lines at the bottom and everybody else. But it seems to be the case that younger millennials have actually, if anything, overtaken older millennials. So the early 1990s cohort are now very slightly more likely to be homeowners in their late 20s than were the 1980s cohort. And the 1980s cohort is nearly caught up with the 1970s cohort. There was a little bit of change in the story in the most recent years. And in particular, so this has been going on, I think, for about the last 4 or 5 years. Even more recently, in the cost of living crisis, I talked about how interest rates were very, very low since the financial crisis. Interest rates now, of course, not very, very low. During the cost of living crisis, banks all over the world put interest rates back up again. So we're now back to 4 or 5% interest rates. And that is having exactly the opposite effect on asset prices as we saw in the financial crisis. So interest rates fall, asset prices go up. When interest rates go up, asset prices fall. We don't yet have official data on what that's done to the wealth distribution, but we've had a go at forecasting it. So if you remember that chart I showed you earlier, looking at the total household wealth compared to national income, and I said that was about 3 in the 1960s and 70s. It rose to about 7 on actual data. We think it went even higher during the pandemic to about 8. But since interest rates have gone up, and asset prices have fallen, that's actually reduced the amount of household wealth in the economy. So we could be back down to 6. So actually household wealth has fallen because interest rates have gone up. As I say, and what does that, in practice, what does that mean? Well, it should help, those higher interest rates should help younger cohorts catch up when it comes to wealth. And there are 2 reasons why. The first one, like I've just shown you, is that higher interest rates mean assets are cheaper, and in particular, houses are cheaper, so it should now be easier for people to afford to buy houses. And we definitely have seen house prices fall, especially when you account for inflation. And higher interest rates also mean that it's more beneficial to save. So if you are at the start of your working life and you are putting money into a saving account or into your pension, you're going to get a better return with a 4% interest rate than you would at a 0.5% interest rate. And so it could be, if those high interest rates persist, that younger generations actually find it easier to save their way to higher wealth than did people when interest rates were 0.5% a year. And we do think this is having material impacts on how wealth is distributed across people of different ages. This is switching to age, not generations, but this is so the light blue and the dark blue shows how typical. I showed you the light blue and dark blue before. That's typical wealth for people of different ages, and the green is our forecast of what that looks like, just kind of right now, or at least at the end of last year, given everything we know about how asset prices have changed, right? And you can see that the change between the dark blue line, which is pre-pandemic, and the green line, 2024. It's undoing some of the rise in wealth that older people saw during the 2010s. Maybe up to half of that rise has been undone by recent changes in asset prices. And then if we look at what that means for these kind of cohort profiles, I showed you this before. With the solid lines, what we've done in the dotted lines is projected what we think might happen to typical wealth levels for people of different cohorts. So with those higher interest rates, lowering asset prices, that's bad news if you own a house or have large stocks of assets. So we think that typical wealth holdings will fall by quite a bit for the older generations, much less change for the younger generations. So we might see a compressing of the gap between younger generations and older generations. Okay, just a couple of slides left. I'm going to switch the order of these last two. I want to say a little bit about what the current government's doing in the UK, and in particular, so it's definitely very clear that it has talked about growth being key to getting living standards. Sorry. The bottom line is it's not so much about inequality. It has said a lot about growth and living standards. So it said that growth is the key to getting living standards growing, and it has said it wants to see household living standards growing in every region. It hasn't really said much about inequality, about the gap between the rich and the poor. Some people, I think you may have noticed that the farmers have been out protesting again earlier this week, and that was because in the autumn budget last year, the Chancellor introduced a number of small tweaks to inheritance tax and capital gains tax that will raise the Treasury more money or mean higher tax bills for people who have wealth. And some people have argued that shows that the Chancellor was alert to the idea of wealth inequality and was trying to do her bit to reduce it. I mean, we can discuss that. I'm less sure. I feel like the measures were more just about tidying up around the edges and trying to get rid of the worst the most egregious of these tax breaks or the biggest differences between different types of income and different types of wealth. It was more a tidying up rather than a full-blooded assault on wealth inequality. And then to switch back, and then just to end with, what could we do? And very, very good to discuss this. The late Tony Atkinson, there's the quote at the top is from the late Tony Atkinson, basically saying, there's not a single thing you can do. There's not one single lever you can pull to reduce the amount of inequality in society. And so Tony Atkinson was arguing it's going to take action everywhere in all aspects of our society. In my book, I focused on what economists can do, and I leaving aside politics, and highlighted three things that would definitely help produce a more equal society: a fairer labour market, a broad and generous welfare state, curbing excesses at the top, as well as focusing on social mobility, and taxing wealth a little bit better. None of those things are particularly aimed at wealth inequality per se. They are more trying to address, well, if you thought that the British society was more unequal overall, what might you want to do about it? But what I didn't look at, and what I think other people argue, is that to really tackle inequality in the UK, you have to go beyond the labour market, the housing market, and living standards, and think about how inequality and the gap between rich and the poor is affecting the media and how it's affecting politics. And I think that's very much not my area of expertise. So sorry for speeding up at the end. We are basically done now, and this slide is reminding you of what I've said. So we started off by saying that although measures of inequality haven't really changed, and even measures of wealth inequality haven't changed, what has changed has been the surging value of household wealth, going from like 3 times GDP to 7 times GDP over the last 4 decades. And that's had very strong intergenerational effects. It's been very bad news for younger cohorts, good news for the older cohorts. And that's happened at the same time as these same people have been hammered by a slowing down in the economy and the labour market, which means they've seen lower wages as well as finding it harder to accumulate assets. Although ending at the end with a little bit of good news, maybe the story is slightly changing with a tiny bit of catch-up from millennials, but there's still very much a long way to go. I'll end it there.